Okay, this is your final 24 review of everything you must be able to do to have success on your tests on Monday. Okay, so we're going to go through all these questions. If there are things you know that you can't do when you watch this video or when you're listening, yeah, especially when you're listening right now in class, you have to be able to then go home and this weekend on Sunday night, watch this video again. Fast forward the video to the questions you knew you couldn't do before. Try the question again and see if you could then, after 4 days, be able to procedurally get the answer to a question that you know you can't do. And if you can't, you have to listen to my explanation and see if you can internalize what mistakes you're making every time and not do them again and again. So we'll start with question number one. Question number one says 2/3. It says MI. This means mixed, and this means improper. So what is 2 2/3 as an improper fraction? Well, if I was to draw 2, there's 1, there's 2, and there's 2/3. So 2 2/3 looks like this. And when we say, well, how many thirds is this? How many thirds are here? You could probably say there's 6/3 because we have a third and 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 a third. So there are 6/3 there. So 6/3 equals 2 plus an additional 2/3. Altogether, as an improper fraction, we would have 8/3. Now some people like to do it using a method, and they realize that if they go 3 times 2 is 6, right? 3 times 2 is 6, which is defining how many thirds the whole number has. 6 plus, so you multiply here and add here, plus an additional 2/3, which is right here, and they would say therefore it's 8/3. Okay, so procedurally, you don't have to draw this every time. You can simply multiply the denominator by the whole number to see how many thirds or fifths or halves or whatever it is you're looking at the whole number contains. And then you add on the additional non-fractional part to get your 8/3. Using that same methodology, if I had 4 3/4, 4 times 4 is 16, plus 3 is 19, 19/4. If I was to draw it, this is what it would look like, 4 3/4. So how many quarters does this 4 represent? It represents 16 quarters, plus an additional 3/4. Altogether, I would have 19 quarters. Now your second or your third question says 19/5 as an improper fraction is how many, is what is a mixed fraction. So if you take 19, and if you're to divide it by 5, you say, how many 5s are there in 19? And you said 3. That is your whole number, because you could have, if I was to draw this, this is what it would look like in terms of how many fifths there are. 15, there's 5/5 here, there's 5/5 here, and there's 5/5 here. That is 15/5, meaning I have a remainder of 4. So if I have a remainder of 4, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Altogether right now, this picture represents 19/5, which is 3 and 4/5 remaining. Okay? So whatever you have for your, when you divide them, if you can divide, you get a 3, which is your whole number, which represents this part here. Your remainder represents this part, and your denominator stays the same. So your answer is 3 and 4/5. With your next one, how many 10s in 26? There are 2. Remainder 6, which means you have 2. Remainder 6. Now it does say LT. It reminds you that when you have a fraction, you should express it in lowest terms. And since 6 and 10 are both even numbers, I can reduce it down to 2 and 3/5. Now some people think that you have to divide this 2 by 2 as well, but that would be ridiculous. You don't divide your whole number by that. You're asking, you have 2 full pizzas and 6/10 of a pizza, which means you have 2 full pizzas and 3/5, which is the same as 6/10. When we go on to the, oh, I think I accidentally photocopy this. Where are we at here? Oh, yeah. So question number 5 is 1/4 plus 3/5. Common denominator will be 20. Now, if you forget how to get common denominators, there's two ways you can get it. You can simply multiply 4 by 5 to get a common denominator, or you can find the lowest common denominator by examining all of the multiples of each number and figuring out which multiple they share first. In this case, it does happen to be 20, which works out well. So 20 is the lowest common denominator. After you get that, you have to make equivalent fractions. So 5/20 and 12/20. Once you have your common denominator of 20, you have 5/20 plus 12/20. Keep your denominator and add your numerators to get 17/20 as your final answer. Your next question, 5/8 and 1/4. Again, if I was simply to multiply 8 by 4 and get 32, I could use 32 as a common denominator, but that wouldn't be the lowest common denominator because when I look at my multiples of each, it shares 8. 8 would be the lowest of the common denominator. 16 would be the next lowest. So I like to use the smallest common denominator because it keeps my fractions as small as they can be. So 5/8 is 5/8. Equivalent fraction here would be 2/8. 5 take away 2 over 8 will equal a final answer of 3/8. Question, whatever it is 1.5 plus 5/7. Now there's two ways to do it. Obviously, you can add your whole numbers together and add your fractional parts together. That will work. So you could take 1 and put it down here and then take your half plus 5/7. You could do that. That works. But what I like to do is I like to take all of my mixed fractions and make them into improper fractions and do this instead. This is what I like to do instead. So if you do it this way, great. If you do it the other way, whatever. I'm just telling you, this is the best way. So the equivalent fraction will be 21/14. That's the same thing as 1.5. They're equivalent. And 10/14 is the same thing as 5/7. Once you have your common denominator, add your numerators and keep your denominator. And you get 31/14. Now, how many 14s in 31? There's 2. That's 28. Remainder 3, which means your answer is 2 and 3/14. 2 and 3/14. Now, if you're watching this video or you're watching it right now and you can't copy down, no problem, because what can you do after? If there's not enough time to copy things down, I get that, but you can watch it later on when it's on YouTube. No problem. Question number, whatever this is, 2.5 take away 1 3/5. You can never subtract fractions when they're in mixed fraction form without being a little bit more complex than they need be, because you could do 2 take away 1, but 1/2 take away 3/5. 1/2 is smaller than 3/5, which means you have to borrow and it becomes complex. And why bother? Why not just say 5/2 take away 8/5? That's the same question. Find your common denominator, make your equivalent fractions, subtract your numerators, and keep your denominator. So much easier. 25 take away 16 is 9, and your final answer will be 9/10. If you did it a different way, that's fine, as long as you got the answer 9/10. That's the important part, right? But you need to know that this is improper. These are equivalent fractions. And subtracting fractions requires you to subtract the numerators and keep the denominator and circle your answer. What's the equation here? Well, it was 1/3. And how many 1/3 do we have? We have 5 groups of 1/3, or 1/3 times 5. I'm not really picky on which way you do it. But since it's an equation, if you had 5 groups of 1/3, you would have 5/3 or 1 2/3 as your answer. So the equation means you need to have an equal sign. So 5 times 1/3 equals 5/3, or, as a mixed fraction, 1 2/3. Your next question says, what's this as a division equation? Well, you started with 3/4, And you divided it into how many parts? You divided it into 1, 2, 3 parts. So you divided it into 3 parts. All right, so your equation or your expression would be that. And when I work it out, each part would be 1, 2, 3 parts out of 12, or in lowest terms, because both are divisible by 3, 1/4. So this is the expression, and that is the lowest term answer. What is the multiplication equation here? Well, you took 3/4, and how much of 3/4 are you keeping? You're keeping 2/3 of 3/4, because this is what the red represents. So 2/3 of 3/4 as a multiplication expression would be this. When I work it out, I'm going to get 6/12 as an answer, or in lowest terms, 1/2. How much time do I have left? 3 minutes? Okay. Oh, this one takes a long time. I have just enough time to do this. So, the area of the entire rectangle, as we said before, is the product of 2.5 multiplied by 1 1/5. That would be the area of the whole rectangle. But that whole rectangle is broken up into 4 parts: an A, a B, a C, and a D. Part A, right here, has a length of 2 and a width of 1, so it has an area of 2. B has a width of 1/2 and a length of 1, or 1/2 times 1, which is 1/2. C is 1/5 times 2, which is 2/5. And D is 1/5 times 1/2, which is 1/10. So instead of multiplying this by this, I can take all 4 of the smaller parts and add them together, and that should be the same answer. So, bring your whole number down. Find your common denominator of 10. 5/10, 4/10, and 1/10 equals 10/10. Ooh, this is exciting. Which equals 1. Bring this with your 2. So your 2 plus your 1 means that the product of 2.5 times 1 1/5 should equal 3. And of course, we're going to check our answer. 5/2 multiplied by 6/5 would be 30/10, which would be equal to 3. Okay, this is question number 13, or the first question on the second last row, 4/5 times 4. This is from chapter 6.1. Now, when we learned this, we first, because we didn't know any rules of how to get answers, the first thing we did is we took 4/5, and all we did was we actually drew it 4 times. Right? So that's doubling it, that's tripling it, that's multiplying it by 4, and then I said, well, how many fifths do I have? And I have 4 here, I have 4 here, I have 4 here, and I have 4 here, so I have 16/5 was my answer. But now that we know how to do it using a method, we knew that we could take 4/5 multiplied by 4 as a fraction of 4/1, multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators. We end up with 16/5. Same answer, but we get it without having to draw the question. The next question is 3/5, 3/4 divided by 5. So when we first did this chapter, we took 3/4 and we divided it into 5 parts. And we said, how big is each part if you had 3/4 and divided by 5? And the answer would be, your denominator would be 20, and we would have 1, 2, 3 parts out of 20. So your answer was, when we learned how to do it with modeling, 3/20. But we've evolved our thinking, and now we know that 3/4 divided by 5 is really that. And to solve it, we can multiply by the reciprocal of 5, which is 1/5. When we multiply the numerators, we get 3. When we multiply the denominators, we get 20. We still end up with the same answer of 3/20 without having to model. Your next question is the multiplication of a mixed number by a mixed number. Now, when we first learned it, we learned to take 1.5 and 2 3/4 and find the areas of both A, B, C, and D and add them together, and that would be the product of 1.5 times 2 3/4. But of course, there's an easier way. Convert 1.5 to improper. Convert 2 3/4 to improper. Multiply your numerators to get 33. Multiply your denominators to get 8. And the answer would be 4, which is 32 and 1/8. Your next question is division of a fraction by a fraction. So the rule is keep your first fraction, change to multiplication, and use the reciprocal of the second. If possible, you could cross-reduce, which would be wonderful because it'd be 1 over 2, giving you a final answer of 5 over 4. But if you didn't cross-reduce, you ended up with 15 over 12, which will reduce because both are divisible by 3, to 5 over 4. As a final answer, 5/4 is 1 and 1/4. 5/4 is the same thing as 1 and 1/4. 7 divided by 3/4 is this is a variation of a question that some people get stuck on, but 7 is 7 over 1 multiplied by the reciprocal of 3/4 would be 28 over 3, which is 9, because 9 times 3 is 27, and 1 left over to make 28. Next question is 2.5 divided by 1 3/8. When dividing, it's easiest to do it as a improper fraction. So 5/2 multiplied by 11/8 is the same thing as 5/2 multiplied by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 1 3/8 is 8/11. Here you can cross-reduce. 8 over 2 will become 4 over 1. When you multiply that, it'll be 20 over 11, which would be 1 and 9/11. If you didn't cross-reduce, you ended up with 40 over 22, which is 1, and 18 over 22, which is equal to 1 and 9 over 11 still. And your last question is a bedmass question, 1.5 plus 2/3 times 2 1/6. The first thing I would do, if I was doing this question, is I would change everything to mixed, from mixed to improper, excuse me. I would then probably, if I'm not very good at order of operations, remind myself that I have to do that first, which means I'm not going to do this until I figure out what the product of these two things is, which is 26 over 18. I'm not going to cross-reduce. If you cross-reduced, you got 13 over 3, or 13 over, 13 over 3. Sorry, 13 over 9. 13 over 9, sorry. But if you didn't get 13 over 9, you kept that, doesn't matter. I'm going to use this anyway just to show you that it's still doable this way. That would be 27/18 plus 26/18, which is 53/18, which will be 2 and 17/18. And that is your final answer.